What if everything you thought you knew about the Queen's final wishes was only half the story? Not a crown, not jewels, not land, but a condition, a single sentence. Quiet, legal, almost invisible, and yet powerful enough to freeze millions, fracture a family even further, and put King Charles in an impossible position he never expected to face. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let me ask you something right now. If your mother left behind a final instruction that forced your children to reconcile, would you enforce it? Or would you refuse, even if it meant defying her last wish? Because that is the question shaking the monarchy tonight. Just moments ago, or at least, that's how it feels, word began circulating that King Charles had come across something buried deep inside Queen Elizabeth's will. Not a headline clause. Not something read aloud with solemn ceremony. But a hidden condition, wrapped in legal language so careful, so precise, that it avoided attention for years. A clause allegedly stating that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's inheritance would remain frozen. Not revoked, not erased, just paused. Until one thing happened. Reconciliation. With Charles. With William. With the family Harry walked away from. And suddenly, everything changes. Because money does strange things to families. But families do even stranger things to money. Now pause for a second. This isn't just about wealth, or property, or royal finances. This is about leverage. About whether love can be legislated. About whether forgiveness can be forced. About whether a grandmother, even a queen, can script emotional outcomes from beyond the grave. And perhaps most unsettling of all, what happens when the king himself refuses to play along? Because according to multiple palace-adjacent whispers, when Charles finally understood what the clause implied, he didn't react with anger. He reacted with discomfort, then with resistance, and finally, with words that stunned even his closest advisors. I won't force my sons together under threat of inheritance. I cannot accept this. That sentence alone raises more questions than it answers. Why would Charles refuse something that, on paper, benefits the family's unity? Why reject a clause that could pressure Harry to return, to reconcile, to close the rift that has haunted the monarchy for years? And why is this story exploding now? To understand that, we need to rewind. All the way back to the Queen herself. For decades, Queen Elizabeth was seen as steady, predictable, traditional, a woman who believed deeply in duty, restraint, and continuity. She rarely interfered publicly in family disputes, and when she did, it was subtle, carefully measured, almost surgical. But behind closed doors, those who knew her best often described a different side. A strategist, a long-term thinker, a woman who understood that time was her greatest tool. She outlived scandals. She outlasted critics. She watched generations rise, rebel, return, and repeat the cycle all over again. So the idea that she might include an emotional condition in her will, not to punish, but to influence, suddenly doesn't feel so far-fetched, does it? Think about it. What leverage would a monarch have once she was gone? No speeches, no audiences, no authority in the present tense. Only legacy, only memory, only what she left behind. And if she believed, truly believed, that Harry's departure and estrangement were wounds that could still heal, would she try one last time to nudge him back? Not with commands, but with consequences. This is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because inheritance is supposed to be unconditional, a final act of love, a closing gesture. But what if it wasn't meant as a reward? What if it was meant as an invitation? Or worse, an ultimatum? Here's the contradiction at the heart of this entire saga. Harry and Meghan left the royal system in search of freedom, independence, control over their own narrative. And yet, part of that freedom was built on financial security, some of it tied, directly or indirectly, to royal resources. So if there truly is a clause that says, reconcile before you receive, then it places Harry in a position he swore he would never be in again. Choose family, or choose autonomy. And now add Charles to the equation. A man who waited decades to become king. A man shaped by emotional distance, public scrutiny, and complicated fatherhood. A man who knows better than most what it feels like to grow up under pressure rather than affection. When Charles reads a clause like this, he doesn't just see legal text. He sees himself. He sees two sons who no longer speak freely. A family defined by silence, statements, intermediaries, and carefully worded interviews. And a past where forcing emotional outcomes only led to deeper fractures. So when Charles reportedly says he won't force reconciliation under threat of inheritance, it's not defiance for the sake of power. It's rejection of a method. Because here's the truth no one likes to say out loud. Forced reconciliation isn't reconciliation at all. It's compliance. And compliance doesn't heal resentment. It hides it. Ask yourself this. If Harry returned tomorrow, sat across from William, shook hands, smiled for cameras, but only because millions were on the line, would that really fix anything? Or would it simply delay the next rupture? This is why the clause, if it exists, is so explosive. It turns love into a transaction, forgiveness into a prerequisite, and family into a negotiation table. And now, the public is beginning to sense it. Because timing matters. This story doesn't surface randomly. It surfaces after years of interviews, books, documentaries, and accusations. After trust eroded on all sides. After silence became strategy. It surfaces at a moment when Harry's relationship with his father is strained but not severed. When William's position as heir is solidifying. When Charles, newly crowned and deeply aware of legacy, is choosing what kind of king and what kind of father he wants to be remembered as. And that's the real reason this matters now. Because Charles isn't just reacting to a clause. He's deciding whether he will allow the monarchy to weaponize inheritance in the name of unity. And according to whispers, his answer is no. But that refusal doesn't make the clause disappear. It doesn't unwrite the Queen's words. It doesn't unlock the funds. It doesn't erase the pressure Harry may soon feel, whether from the public, the media, or even within his own household. It simply shifts the conflict. From mother versus sons, to father versus legacy. And that's where the tension tightens. Because once something like this becomes known, truly known, it changes conversations behind closed doors. It changes expectations. It changes motivations. It changes how every gesture is interpreted. A phone call becomes suspicious. A meeting becomes strategic. A silence becomes loud. And somewhere in the middle of all this is Harry. A man caught between principle and inheritance. Between past pain and future security. Between walking away and being pulled back by a clause he never agreed to. So here's the question I want you to sit with as we move forward. Was this clause meant to heal the family? Or expose just how broken it really is? The Queen planned for everything, including the possibility that her own family might fall apart. That sentence alone feels heavy, doesn't it? Because when people think of Queen Elizabeth II, they think of stability, of tradition, of routines that never bent, even when the world did. Red boxes, weekly audiences, Christmas broadcasts that sounded almost timeless. She was the constant in a family and a nation built on continuity. But continuity doesn't mean blindness. And it certainly doesn't mean she didn't see what was happening to her family in her final years. Let me ask you something. Do you really believe the Queen didn't notice the silence between her grandsons? Do you believe she didn't feel the absence when Harry stopped showing up the way he used to? When conversations became formal? When updates arrived through aides instead of phone calls? When laughter turned into protocol? Because here's the first uncomfortable truth we need to confront. By the time Queen Elizabeth began organizing her final affairs, the family fracture was no longer theoretical. It was real. It was personal. And it was permanent enough to worry her. This wasn't a sudden shock. It wasn't a last-minute surprise. It was something she had been watching unfold slowly, painfully, over time. Harry's departure from royal duties didn't just remove him from public events. It removed him from daily life, from casual moments, from unscheduled conversations that actually repair relationships. And the Queen understood something that many people forget. Distance doesn't cool conflict. It preserves it. So when we talk about a supposed hidden clause in her will, we have to understand the mindset behind it. This wasn't about punishment. This was about foresight. Royal wills are not casual documents. They are layered, deliberate, and often structured to avoid public scrutiny. Some elements are sealed. Some are vague by design. Some are written not for lawyers, but for people who know exactly what the words really mean. And Queen Elizabeth knew how to communicate without ever raising her voice. Think about her entire reign. She rarely confronted. She rarely explained. She rarely corrected in public. Instead, she set parameters. and let people reveal themselves within them. So imagine this: an aging monarch, a grandmother, a woman who has seen her children divorce, argue, reconcile, and fracture again. A woman who understands that time is running out, not just for her life, but for the chance to influence outcomes after she's gone. What tool does she have left? Not speeches, not commands, not authority, only conditions. And this is where Chapter 1 truly begins. Because long before King Charles allegedly read that clause, long before whispers reached the public, long before the media began circling, the Queen had already made one quiet decision. She would not leave emotional chaos unmanaged. According to palace insiders who've spoken off the record for years, Queen Elizabeth was deeply troubled by how final the rift between Harry and the rest of the family felt. Not dramatic troubled, not outwardly emotional, but concerned in the way only someone who has lived nearly a century can be. She understood that public statements could harden positions, that interviews could freeze narratives into place, that once people start speaking through cameras instead of each other, repair becomes exponentially harder. And she also understood something else. Money listens when people don't. This is the part that makes many people uncomfortable. We like to believe inheritance is sacred, that it's purely an act of love, that it's unconditional. But historically, especially in royal families, inheritance has always been strategic. It's been used to stabilize dynasties, to reward loyalty, to discourage rebellion, to quietly guide behavior without issuing threats. And Queen Elizabeth knew this better than anyone. So when she reviewed her estate, her trusts, and the mechanisms by which assets would be distributed, she wasn't just thinking about numbers. She was thinking about people: Harry, William, Charles, and the emotional landmines between them. Now here's where the story takes a turn. Because if the clause exists, and we're still in the realm of alleged but increasingly detailed accounts, it wasn't written as a blunt instruction. It wasn't something like, reconcile or receive nothing. That would be too obvious, too aggressive, too easily challenged. Instead, it was reportedly framed in conditional language. Language that spoke of access, of release, of timing, not denial, delay. And that distinction matters more than you might think. Because freezing something isn't the same as taking it away. It creates pressure without finality, hope without certainty, leverage without cruelty. It says, this is still yours, but not yet. And psychologically, that's powerful. Ask yourself honestly, would you fight harder to regain something you lost, or to unlock something that's waiting for you? The Queen understood human behavior. She understood that people are more likely to reconsider positions when they feel something is within reach. And if reconciliation was something she still hoped for, even faintly, then tying it to inheritance would be her final, quiet nudge. But here's the contradiction. Queen Elizabeth was also fiercely protective of free will. She despised overt coercion. She disliked emotional blackmail. She valued dignity, even in disagreement. So how do you reconcile those two sides? By writing a clause that doesn't force behavior, but invites reflection. That's the theory. That's the interpretation many royal watchers now believe fits her character. And yet, intention doesn't erase impact. Because once that clause exists on paper, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a tool others can interpret, enforce, resist, or reject. Which brings us back to Charles. But before we go there, we need to sit with the Queen's mindset a little longer. Imagine her drafting this with advisors. Not rushing, not emotional, measured. She wouldn't have seen it as manipulation. She would have seen it as stewardship. Of money, of family, of legacy. And perhaps, just perhaps, she believed that after her death, emotions would soften. That grief would open doors pride had closed. That Harry, removed from the immediacy of conflict, might see reconciliation differently. She couldn't predict interviews, or books, or documentaries, but she could anticipate regret. She could anticipate that someday, Harry might look back and wonder whether the door was truly closed, or just heavy. And so she left it unlocked, but locked behind a condition. Now here's where the story tightens. Because wills are only powerful when they're acted upon. And for a long time, this clause allegedly wasn't. It sat dormant, ignored, unspoken, overshadowed by grief, transition, and a new reign. Charles was dealing with his own transformation from son to sovereign. William was stepping into increased responsibility. Harry was building a new life across an ocean. There was no appetite for reopening wounds. Until something shifted. And that shift wasn't legal. It was emotional. Because the longer time passed, the more permanent the distance began to feel. And permanence has a way of forcing decisions. At some point, advisors have to clarify structures. Assets have to be categorized. Trusts have to move from theory into execution. And that's when the clause reportedly resurfaced. Not with fanfare, but with quiet urgency. A line highlighted. A paragraph revisited. A conversation that began with, "There's something here you should see." And suddenly, what the Queen may have intended as a gentle posthumous nudge becomes something far heavier. A frozen inheritance. A moral dilemma. A test no one asked to take. And that's where the story stops being about the Queen. Because once she's gone, interpretation belongs to the living. And the living don't always agree. So ask yourself this as we prepare to move forward. Was the Queen trying to heal the family? Or was she simply acknowledging a truth no one else wanted to face? That reconciliation, without incentive, might never happen? Because the next chapter isn't about what the Queen wrote. It's about how that writing was hidden, why it wasn't discussed openly, and who decided that silence was safer than honesty. Think about that for a second. The most powerful woman in the world, who controlled a monarchy for decades, chose to hide one of the most potentially explosive instructions in her final will. Not in a dramatic, ceremonial reading. Not in front of advisors or family. Quietly, carefully, hidden within legal language. Almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Why would she do that? Because, as history shows, secrecy is power. It isn't always about deception. Sometimes, it's about control. Not controlling people, but controlling consequences. Ensuring that actions, not words, dictate outcomes. Royal wills are complex by design. Some sections are meticulously detailed, others intentionally vague. They operate on multiple levels: legal, financial, and emotional. Advisors often interpret them, but the public rarely sees the inner workings. And here, in the depths of one such document, allegedly lay a paragraph that could alter the trajectory of two lives, Harry and Meghan, and the very dynamics of the monarchy. Imagine reading a clause like this for the first time. You're Charles, King of England, tasked with maintaining the legacy of your mother while managing fractured relationships with your own children. The words don't just describe a condition. They carry emotional weight, moral expectations, and the subtle force of a queen who has seen it all and knows exactly how to make people act. Sources suggest the clause was framed in precise, almost surgical language. It didn't command action. It didn't scold. Instead, it established a condition, a trigger. The inheritance wouldn't be accessible until reconciliation occurred. But here's the subtlety. It didn't define reconciliation. Was a phone call enough? A meeting? Public appearances together? Or a private, heartfelt conversation? The ambiguity is key. Because ambiguity allows room for interpretation and for resistance. And it turns out that interpretation is where the real drama begins. For decades, the royal family has operated in a system where public image and private reality often collide. Smiles in front of cameras can mask tension. Courtesies in private can hide resentment. And a clause like this, hidden in a legal document, suddenly gives formal weight to an unspoken emotional truth. Relationships can be dictated, delayed, and challenged, but they cannot be fully controlled. Now, here's a question for you. If someone told you that your inheritance, the thing that could secure your future, provide comfort, and reward your loyalty, was frozen until you made amends with someone you've spent years avoiding, how would you react? Harry's reportedly reaction is what you'd expect: conflict, confusion, resentment, but also a twinge of reflection. After all, nobody wants to feel manipulated. Nobody wants to be pulled back into drama they tried to escape. And yet, even freedom has strings attached when money, legacy, and family are involved. But let's step back. Why was this clause hidden in the first place? According to palace insiders, the Queen was acutely aware that overt instructions could backfire. If she had written a clause demanding reconciliation outright, it could have been challenged legally, dismissed as coercion, or worse, rejected by the very people she hoped to guide. By embedding it subtly, she ensured it would only be discovered by those who were both invested and capable of understanding the nuance. It's almost like a test. Not a test in the cruel sense, but a test in the strategic sense. Who would notice? Who would care? Who would interpret it wisely? And that brings us to Charles. When he allegedly uncovered the clause, it wasn't just the financial implications that weighed on him. It was the emotional calculus. He had to decide, do I enforce this, knowing it might push my son away? Do I interpret it strictly or with leniency? Do I honor my mother's words or protect my child from what could feel like posthumous manipulation? The reports suggest Charles paused, thought, maybe even questioned. He wasn't just dealing with a document. He was grappling with decades of family history, emotional wounds, and the delicate balance of monarchy and parenthood. Meanwhile, Harry's distance only complicated matters. Every choice he made, every interview, every public statement added layers to the challenge. Reconciliation wasn't just a personal choice, it was a calculation. And Meghan's involvement added further dimensions: loyalty, public perception, and personal autonomy, all intertwined. Now, let's zoom in on the mechanics of this clause. Experts suggest that frozen inheritance clauses aren't uncommon in aristocratic or royal contexts. They serve to influence behavior without overt coercion. They create a framework where emotional decisions carry tangible consequences. But in this case, the stakes were uniquely personal. We're not just talking about land or titles. We're talking about legacy, memory, and the final words of a queen who understood the fragility of relationships better than anyone. And here's a twist most people don't consider. While the clause may have been hidden, the consequences of discovering it are public. Because once Charles shared, intentionally or otherwise, that the inheritance is conditional, the world suddenly has an insight into the family's private negotiations. Every statement, every refusal, every interaction becomes loaded with meaning. And the media, of course, is ready to amplify every nuance. Which raises the question, who benefits from secrecy and who suffers from revelation? The Queen's intent might have been subtle, but the fallout is anything but. The emotional stakes, the legal implications, the family tensions, all converge to create a situation where every word, every glance, every decision is scrutinized. Think about it. A clause hidden for years suddenly surfaces. It carries emotional weight. It carries financial weight. And it carries public scrutiny. That's a perfect storm. And the most shocking part? This is only the beginning. Because while the clause has been discovered, it hasn't yet been acted upon fully. Charles's response is critical. Harry's reaction is crucial. William's perspective, Meghan's interpretation, advisors' counsel. Every layer adds tension, complexity, and unpredictability. And that's where the drama escalates. Not just because money is at stake, but because human emotion is at stake. Because pride, loyalty, love, resentment, all are now codified in a legal document that demands action, reflection, and consequence. So as we move forward, keep this in mind. The Queen's hidden clause wasn't just a legal mechanism. It was a narrative device, a tool to challenge, provoke, and perhaps guide the family toward resolution, or to expose the fractures that couldn't be ignored any longer. And the discovery of this clause sets the stage for an unprecedented confrontation, not in the public eye, but behind closed doors where the decisions will shape not only inheritance, but the emotional landscape of the monarchy for years to come. It sounds almost cinematic, doesn't it? Like a plot from a royal drama. But this isn't fiction. According to the emerging reports, this is very real. A life-altering condition embedded within the Queen's final will. The inheritance isn't gone. It's waiting. But it is suspended, held hostage by something intangible: reconciliation. Let's unpack that for a moment. Inheritance, for most people, is a straightforward concept. A parent dies, assets transfer, life continues, for better or worse. But in the royal context, inheritance is never just financial. It carries symbolism, responsibility, and history. It represents trust, continuity, and family legacy. And when that inheritance is conditional, the stakes aren't money alone. The stakes are emotion, loyalty, and power. Imagine Harry reading this clause. He's living thousands of miles away, carving out independence, creating a life with Meghan, free from the scrutiny he left behind. And now, suddenly, a letter, a will, surfaces suggesting that all of it is contingent. That his freedom, while real in some ways, is linked to a past he has struggled to reconcile with. And that's the contradiction. Because Harry didn't leave England lightly. He left to escape rules, protocols, and expectations. He left to build a family life without the monarchy dictating every move. He left to define himself outside the shadow of legacy. Yet here he is, decades later, being asked to confront that very shadow once more. It's more than inconvenient. It's emotional. For someone like Harry, this is deeply personal. Because reconciliation in his world isn't a casual meeting or a brief handshake. It requires vulnerability, something Harry, having been publicly criticized, scrutinized, and judged, has learned to protect at all costs. And then there's Meghan. Meghan didn't grow up in royalty. She grew up navigating public perception, media scrutiny, and family conflict of a different nature. Yet suddenly, she is drawn into a centuries-old drama where a clause, written by a woman she never met, defines part of her family's future. It's a tangle of generational expectations, privilege, and emotional labor. And the weight of that tangle falls squarely on their shoulders. Let's pause and consider the mechanics of the clause again. According to sources, the inheritance isn't revoked. That's crucial. It remains, almost like a prize waiting at the end of a labyrinth. But the path to reach it isn't mapped. Reconciliation is vague. There's no checklist, no defined gesture that counts as sufficient. A phone call might suffice. A meeting might suffice. Or perhaps, something more profound, an apology, a confession, or a public acknowledgement, might be necessary. The ambiguity is deliberate. And here's where it gets psychologically complex. When something you desire is within reach, but requires emotional labor you're reluctant to give, it creates pressure. Pressure is a double-edged sword. It motivates some, but it frustrates others. It can prompt reflection, or it can deepen resentment. Harry, in this moment, faces that precise tension. Do you comply? Do you meet the terms? Do you negotiate your emotional boundaries with the family you once called home? Or do you walk away, knowing that the inheritance, while significant, is secondary to your personal principles? It's a question most people never face. But for Harry, it's front and center. And let's not forget the public dimension. Once whispers of the clause became known, speculation erupted. Social media exploded with opinion. News outlets parsed every possible angle. And in the age of constant visibility, Harry and Meghan are no longer just private actors. They are symbols. Symbols of independence, rebellion, and modern royalty. Which makes every decision higher stakes. Because now, action, or inaction, will be scrutinized publicly. Will reconciliation be seen as opportunistic? Will refusal be seen as selfish? The court of public opinion has its own rules, and those rules rarely align with the personal morality Harry or Meghan might hold. And this is where Charles's role becomes critical. According to insiders, Charles doesn't just enforce the clause mechanically. He interprets it. He weighs it against his own experiences, his own regrets, and his understanding of what is possible within family dynamics. He knows the clause could be used as leverage, and he reportedly refuses to weaponize it. Think about that. A king, aware of a legal condition he could enforce to manipulate behavior, chooses restraint. And yet restraint brings its own complications. Because the clause exists, it has power. It hangs over Harry and Meghan. And even if Charles refuses to push, the very knowledge that it exists is enough to influence decisions. Now, here's a twist you might not expect. Some royal observers suggest that this clause, while framed as a condition, may actually reflect the Queen's understanding of human behavior. She may have known that the threat of delayed inheritance would be more effective than outright command. That Harry, confronted with possibility rather than obligation, might choose reflection over defiance. It's subtle, it's brilliant, and it's ruthless in its own way. And yet, here's the irony. By leaving this clause, the Queen may have intended to foster unity, but she also introduced the potential for conflict. Because conditions create tension, conditions create interpretation, and interpretation invites disagreement. So Harry faces not just a moral decision, but a psychological one. He must navigate his own principles, Meghan's perspective, and the subtle pressure exerted by a clause designed to influence behavior without overt coercion. And make no mistake, this is about more than money. The inheritance is significant, yes, but it's also symbolic. It's a tangible representation of family recognition, approval, and connection. To delay it is to remind Harry and Meghan that reconciliation is not just emotional, but material. That the past, unresolved, carries consequences that extend into their present lives. And in that tension lies the drama. Because when the inheritance is frozen, Harry doesn't just see a financial decision. He sees a mirror. He sees choices. He sees the possibility of returning or staying away. He sees pride and pain, forgiveness and resentment, hope and regret. And Meghan? She sees it too. She sees the balance of protecting family, preserving independence, and navigating a world that has always judged her, and them, harshly. She sees the stakes not just for herself, but for their children. She sees the tension between principle and pragmatism, love and leverage. This is why the clause is so explosive. It isn't a document. It's a dynamic, a force, a pivot around which the next chapter of the royal family's story must turn. And yet, for all the speculation, the debate, and the drama, there is one undeniable fact. The inheritance remains inaccessible. It waits. It lingers. It looms. And while Harry and Meghan weigh their next steps, Charles observes, interprets, and decides. He reportedly refuses to enforce the clause in a coercive way, but the tension is already palpable. The moral, emotional, and financial pressure is real, whether he acts or not. So the question isn't whether the inheritance exists. It's whether Harry and Meghan will choose to navigate the conditions required to unlock it. And if they do, at what cost, emotionally, publicly, and personally? Because the clause, simple in its wording, is anything but simple in consequence. And just as the stakes begin to crystallize, another layer of tension emerges. Advisors, public perception, and even the extended royal family now have opinions. Every conversation, every decision, every silence carries weight. And Harry and Meghan are caught at the center of a storm that is as emotional as it is strategic. The inheritance, frozen. The reconciliation, optional but demanded. The consequences, immediate and long-lasting. And yet, the world doesn't fully know what the next move will be. But what comes next isn't just about who will act first. It's about what action, when taken, will ripple through history, and whether the royal family can survive the confrontation that is coming. Because once you introduce a conditional inheritance into a fractured family, there's no turning back. And as Harry contemplates the choice in front of him, one thing is certain. The pause imposed by the clause is more than financial. It's emotional, and it's far from over. It's easy to forget that Charles, as king, carries responsibilities that few can comprehend. He inherited not only a crown, but decades of unresolved family tension. Every decision he makes echoes through history, public opinion, and personal relationships. And now, this clause, hidden, subtle, and emotionally charged, lands squarely in his lap. According to insiders, when Charles first read the Queen's instructions, he felt a mixture of disbelief and frustration. Disbelief that such a clause had been tucked away without his knowledge. Frustration at the moral tightrope it forced him to walk. Because on paper, the clause looks simple. Harry and Meghan must reconcile before accessing their inheritance. But in practice, the implications are anything but simple. It's a trap, yes, but not one designed to punish. It's a trap designed to test, to provoke reflection, to force choices that no one wants to make. And Charles, unlike the Queen, could no longer rely on silence as a tool. The world is watching. Media speculation is rampant. Every advisor has an opinion. Every family member's reaction is scrutinized. And the king's own sense of fairness, morality, and parental responsibility now collide with the legal weight of a clause written decades ago. Let's pause for a moment. Picture Charles sitting in his private study. Letters from advisors. Legal documents stacked neatly on the desk. Notes about trusts, wills, and financial structures. And in the middle of it all, the highlighted line. Inheritance conditional upon reconciliation. Simple words. Monumental impact. He reportedly leaned back in his chair, feeling the tension settle in his chest. A test, yes. But whose test? And who benefits if it's enforced? Charles's internal debate likely mirrored the one many parents face, magnified 1,000-fold. Do you push a child to act in a way you believe is right, even if they resist? Or do you respect autonomy, knowing the decision could hurt the family in the long run. For Charles, the stakes were higher than just one family dispute. They were a matter of legacy, a matter of precedent, a matter of perception, both private and public. Here's the twist. Charles is not naive. He knows the Queen's mind. He knows her foresight. And he also knows Harry. He knows that forcing a reunion under threat of inheritance could backfire spectacularly. Harry has historically resisted manipulation, whether through media scrutiny, public opinion, or familial pressure. And the last thing Charles wants is for the clause to become a weapon, whether intentionally or inadvertently, against the son he loves. This is where the emotional complexity deepens. Charles reportedly held private conversations with close advisors, weighing the options. Enforce the clause strictly and risk alienating Harry further. Interpret it leniently and risk criticism for ignoring the Queen's instructions. Attempt to compromise and navigate a labyrinth of emotional landmines that could implode at any moment. And then there's Meghan. Her role cannot be understated. As Harry's partner, her influence is both emotional and practical. She has helped shape Harry's decisions, grounded him, and provided perspective from outside the royal tradition. But she also represents independence, a refusal to bow to outdated expectations. And any approach to enforcing reconciliation has to consider her presence, her perception, and her influence over the decisions Harry makes. It's a delicate dance, and according to insiders, Charles knows it. He reportedly told advisors something that has circulated quietly among palace circles. I will not be the one to coerce reconciliation under threat of inheritance. That is not my way. That is not how love works. That is not how family works. Think about that for a moment. A king of England, confronted with a legal condition he could leverage to force a reunion, chooses restraint. It is almost revolutionary. And yet, as wise as this stance might be, it carries consequences. Because the clause still exists, the inheritance is still frozen. Harry and Meghan are aware, even if only through whispers, that their financial security is contingent upon an emotional outcome. And the pressure, subtle or not, begins to shape decisions, interactions, and perceptions. Charles reportedly understands this, too. He knows that even without active enforcement, the knowledge of the clause exerts influence. He knows that its existence creates tension, provokes reflection, and shapes behavior, sometimes more effectively than overt demands. And here's the irony. By refusing to weaponize the clause, Charles both honors his mother's foresight and preserves his own moral integrity. But he also ensures the drama continues. Because the inheritance, though paused, is a force, and Harry, Meghan, and the rest of the family are now compelled to respond, consciously or unconsciously, to its presence. Let's add another layer, public perception. The monarchy exists in a dual reality. It operates privately, within the walls of palaces and family estates. But it is also public, subject to scrutiny, interpretation, and commentary. Any perceived action or inaction is magnified. Social media, 24-hour news, and public speculation turn private decisions into public theater. And the clause, once whispered about or revealed, becomes a narrative tool for the media, commentators, and critics alike. Every choice, then, carries not only emotional and financial weight, but reputational weight. Every silence is interpreted. Every conversation is analyzed. Every step toward or away from reconciliation is magnified. Charles reportedly grapples with this constantly. He must navigate what is right for his children, what is right for the monarchy, and what is right for history, all simultaneously. And the stakes are compounded by history itself. The royal family has long endured fractures, disagreements, and departures. Past conflicts often set precedents, influencing future decisions. And Charles knows that how he handles this clause will be remembered, debated, and possibly criticized for decades to come. Yet despite all of this, one fact remains clear. Charles refuses to use the clause as leverage. But as is often true with emotional and financial conditions, refusing to act doesn't eliminate the effect. The pause, the uncertainty, the suspended inheritance, all continue to shape decisions, influence behavior, and deepen the drama. Which brings us to a crucial turning point. Because once Harry and Meghan are aware of the clause, the next phase begins. It's no longer theoretical. It's immediate. It's personal. and it's public enough that the ripple effects extend beyond the family, reaching advisors, media, and the broader royal institution. Imagine Harry receiving confirmation, official or otherwise, that access to inheritance is contingent on reconciliation. His first reactions would likely be anger, disbelief, and confusion. But over time, that anger could shift to reflection, strategizing, or negotiation. And Meghan's influence will inevitably guide these responses, adding layers of complexity, strategy, and emotional nuance. At the same time, Charles watches, evaluates, and prepares. He understands that enforcing, ignoring, or interpreting the clause has consequences, and that each choice could redefine relationships for decades. So what do we see here? A family caught in the intersection of legacy, love, money, and power. A clause that is both simple in text and explosive in effect. A king who must balance integrity, morality, and strategy. And two individuals, Harry and Meghan, whose choices are now subtly dictated by forces both legal and emotional. And yet, for all the complexity, one truth is undeniable. The pause imposed by the clause is real. The decision-making is real. The emotional pressure is real. And the next move, whether taken by Harry, Meghan, or Charles, will change the dynamics of this family forever. Because this is no longer about inheritance alone. It is about legacy. It is about reconciliation. It is about choices that echo far beyond money. And as the chapter closes, one question hangs in the air. What will Harry do when confronted with the reality of this frozen inheritance and the emotional condition that comes with it? No dramatic reveal, no cameras flashing, no shouting across a palace corridor, just a discreet message delivered through channels only royal insiders could navigate. And yet, the impact was seismic, because the content was simple, but the implication was vast. The inheritance he expected, the financial and symbolic security he may have assumed was his by birthright, was now conditional. Pause here. Think about that. Imagine being thousands of miles away, living a life you designed for independence, and then suddenly discovering that the legacy left by your own grandmother, the woman who defined duty, tradition, and family, comes with strings. Not explicit threats, not ultimatums, just conditions that demand reconciliation before access. It's subtle, but it hits deeply, because inheritance, in Harry's world, isn't just about wealth. It's about acknowledgement, approval, connection, and now, that acknowledgement is being held hostage, frozen until he can bridge gaps he once chose to leave behind. According to palace sources, Harry's initial reaction was layered, as you might expect. Frustration, confusion, a sense of betrayal, but also reflection, because he is no stranger to pressure. He has faced media scrutiny that borders on persecution. He has been criticized for decisions he made to protect his mental health and personal autonomy. He has navigated public opinion while living life in the crosshairs of one of the most powerful institutions in the world. And yet, this clause brought a new kind of pressure, personal, emotional, and intimate, that no one else could mediate. Add Meghan into the equation, and the stakes multiply. She has been Harry's anchor, guiding him through public battles and private dilemmas alike. But she is also someone with her own perspective, her own instincts, and her own understanding of fairness. And now, the couple faces a dilemma that is part legal, part emotional, and entirely unprecedented. Let's break this down. The inheritance is frozen. That is, in itself, a subtle but powerful form of influence. Frozen inheritance is not a denial, it is a pause. It creates tension, opportunity, and reflection. It says, this is yours, but not yet. And psychologically, the human mind reacts strongly to not yet. The promise is tantalizing. It motivates. It irritates. It forces calculation. And when applied to someone as independent and self-aware as Harry, it triggers a storm of thoughts. Should I reconcile to unlock it? Is this manipulation? How much am I willing to compromise? According to insider accounts, the reaction in Harry's inner circle was immediate. Advisors, friends, and confidants weighed in. Each had a theory. Each had a strategy. Some urged reconciliation for the sake of legacy. Others warned against appearing coerced. And some emphasized that independence should not be sacrificed, even for financial gain. And that's the delicate balance. Because the clause doesn't just affect Harry personally. It affects Meghan. It affects their children. It affects their public image. It even affects future interactions with William and Charles. Every move is interconnected. Every decision is scrutinized. And every response has implications that ripple across generations. Now, let's talk about Charles's perspective in this moment. Reports indicate that he watched quietly. He understood the power of the clause, the weight it carries, but he also understood the danger of overt enforcement. Charles could have used it to compel a reunion, to manipulate behavior, or to leverage compliance. But that would have crossed a line he reportedly refuses to breach. And in doing so, Charles maintains a moral high ground. He respects autonomy. He respects his son's agency. But he also knows that mere awareness of the clause exerts pressure. Sometimes, the knowledge alone can provoke reflection, negotiation, or reconsideration. Here's where the drama intensifies. Because Harry and Meghan are not making decisions in a vacuum. The media is aware. Public opinion is aware. Royal observers, commentators, and global audiences are aware. And in today's environment, awareness alone can influence behavior. Every statement, every social media post, every public appearance, they are now viewed through the lens of this frozen inheritance. Is reconciliation sincere? Is avoidance a rebellion? Is engagement strategic or heartfelt? The scrutiny is relentless, and the pressure is subtle but omnipresent. Let's not overlook the symbolic nature of this clause. Financially, the inheritance is significant, yes. But more importantly, it represents recognition, acknowledgement from the family, from the monarchy, from the Queen herself. To delay it is to signal that certain emotional criteria remain unmet. It's a tangible reflection of intangible relationships. And for Harry, that is challenging. Because he has always valued honesty, principle, and autonomy. The clause forces him to weigh those values against familial expectations, public perception, and material considerations. It is a conflict few people outside royal circles can comprehend, but its intensity is profound. Meanwhile, Meghan's perspective adds further complexity. She is protective of Harry, wary of coercion, and attuned to the psychological dynamics at play. Her counsel reportedly emphasizes maintaining agency while carefully navigating potential reconciliation, a balancing act that requires strategic thinking, emotional intelligence, and long-term planning. Here's another twist. Sources suggest that the clause was not initially known to William. His awareness came later, adding another layer of tension. Because William, already positioned as heir and accustomed to scrutiny, now faces a moral and strategic question of his own. How to respond, how to engage, and how to interpret Harry's actions without exacerbating an already fragile situation. And this is where we see the true brilliance and danger of the Queen's design. The clause isn't just a statement. It's a mechanism that draws out behavior, forces choices, and creates ripple effects. It tests loyalty, love, and judgment. It subtly pressures the parties involved without overt coercion. And in doing so, it exposes fault lines that may have remained hidden otherwise. As insiders describe it, the Queen's foresight was remarkable. She anticipated that money alone might not compel reconciliation, that emotional bonds, unresolved grievances, and pride could obstruct progress. So she created a structure that combined material incentive with moral and emotional reflection, a powerful combination that forces confrontation with one's own values and relationships. Now, here's the cliffhanger. Harry's next steps are unpredictable. Will he reach out? Will he resist? Will he negotiate terms privately or allow public perception to influence decisions? And Meghan's influence? Will it guide him toward reconciliation or toward independence? One thing is certain. The frozen inheritance is no longer just a line in a will. It is a living force. It shapes decisions, provokes reflection, and pressures emotions. And as the story unfolds, every move, every conversation, every choice will carry consequences far beyond the financial realm. Because in this family, as in any family, the most powerful forces are rarely money or legalities. They are emotion, loyalty, pride, and the unspoken histories that define relationships. And as Harry and Meghan confront this reality, one question hangs over every decision. How far are they willing to go to reclaim not just wealth, but family connection? And what will they risk in the process? The revelation of the clause was more than just a shock. It was a seismic shift in the royal family's delicate equilibrium. Harry and Meghan had built a life away from the scrutiny of Buckingham Palace, constructing a world defined on their terms: autonomy, privacy, and a measure of control over their own narrative. And suddenly, everything shifted. A paragraph buried in legal language threatened to pull them back into a conflict they had spent years trying to distance themselves from. Think about the psychology of this moment. Harry had worked tirelessly to establish independence, from financial ventures to philanthropic projects. Meghan had stood alongside him, advocating for their right to shape their family life without interference. And now, the Queen's posthumous intervention, as subtle as it was, reasserted an invisible tether. It's one thing to deal with public opinion. It's another entirely to realize that your grandmother, a figure of immense authority, has crafted a mechanism to influence your behavior even after death. Sources suggest that the couple's first private conversations about the clause were tense, emotional, and fraught with moral dilemmas. Harry reportedly felt anger and frustration at being tested in this way. Meghan, conversely, expressed concern over potential manipulation, cautioning against any reaction that might appear coerced. And this is where the stakes become personal. The clause isn't a static rule. It's a dynamic challenge. It forces choices that intersect with identity, autonomy, and familial bonds. Harry must ask himself, do I pursue reconciliation for the sake of inheritance? Or do I maintain independence, risking financial and symbolic consequences? And Meghan's counsel adds another layer. How do we honor ourselves while navigating a condition imposed from beyond the grave? Meanwhile, Charles watches, reportedly with a sense of moral clarity. Unlike a traditional monarch who might leverage such a clause for compliance, he refuses to manipulate. "I will not force my sons together under threat of inheritance," he allegedly said. "I cannot accept this." Charles's stance is critical. It preserves agency for Harry and Meghan, but it does not remove the clause's psychological weight. Even without coercion, awareness of a frozen inheritance creates pressure. It provokes reflection, influences decisions, and subtly guides behavior, the very effect the Queen may have intended. And let's not underestimate the symbolism. In royal terms, inheritance is never purely financial. It represents approval, continuity, and connection. Freezing it sends a signal. Reconciliation is more than a suggestion. It is a prerequisite for recognition. For Harry, that realization carries emotional weight. He must confront unresolved feelings, historical grievances, and personal pride. And the complexity increases when Meghan's perspective is added. Her protective instincts, strategic thinking, and nuanced understanding of public scrutiny all shape the path forward. The clause also reverberates through the broader family. William reportedly learned about it later, adding another dimension of tension. How does he interpret Harry's actions? How does he respond to Meghan's influence? How does he maintain his own position while respecting the fragile balance of sibling relationships? And then there is the public dimension. The clause, once hinted at or leaked, becomes a point of speculation. Media narratives amplify tension. Every appearance, statement, or interview is filtered through the lens of this inheritance dilemma. Harry and Meghan's choices are scrutinized not only for their personal impact, but also for their symbolic meaning. Loyalty, independence, and the monarchy itself are all under review. At the same time, the mechanics of the clause are intricate. Unlike a direct instruction, it is conditional and ambiguous. Reconciliation is not clearly defined. A phone call might suffice. A private conversation might suffice. Or perhaps a more substantial gesture, public acknowledgement, apology, or joint engagement, might be required. The uncertainty magnifies tension, leaving room for interpretation, negotiation, and emotional maneuvering. Insiders suggest that the Queen's design was intentional. She understood that people rarely act under overt coercion. Instead, subtle conditions, ones that combine material incentive with moral reflection, often provoke the deepest consideration. In this sense, the clause operates as both a guide and a test. It challenges Harry and Meghan to navigate emotion, principle, and strategy simultaneously. And the psychological stakes are enormous. When someone you love, or once loved deeply, is involved, conditional inheritance is no longer just a financial calculation. It becomes a reflection of past grievances, current tensions, and future possibilities. Pride, guilt, loyalty, and hope collide. Observers note that the clause also places Charles in a delicate position. While he refuses to coerce, he must still manage the broader implications for the monarchy. The family's image, the precedent set for inheritance disputes, and the potential fallout in public perception all require careful navigation. Each decision, each conversation, each pause carries significance. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan confront a dual challenge. They must reconcile not only their personal feelings, but also their public narrative. Every move is scrutinized, every statement interpreted, every action measured. And the frozen inheritance remains a silent, potent influence, an unspoken reminder that reconciliation is both desired and necessary for full recognition. The emotional dynamics are further complicated by historical context. Harry's relationship with Charles and William has been fraught for years. Past disagreements, perceived betrayals, and publicized tensions all shape current interactions. And now, a clause written by the Queen adds legal and symbolic weight to these emotional complexities. Imagine the thought process. Do I bridge the gap for material and symbolic gain? Do I preserve independence, even at the cost of alienation? Do I negotiate quietly, publicly, or strategically? How do Meghan's instincts guide or challenge my decisions? And all of this unfolds while the world watches, interprets, and judges. This is the brilliance and cruelty of the Queen's clause. Simple words, profound consequences. Subtle leverage, potent emotional force. A test of character, loyalty, and judgment. And as Harry and Meghan navigate this labyrinth, the stakes continue to rise. Because this is not just a financial condition. It is a moral, emotional, and symbolic one. And every choice they make will ripple across generations, impacting not only their lives, but the perception and stability of the monarchy itself. As the chapter closes, the question remains, will Harry and Meghan act, resist, or hesitate? And what consequences will each path carry, both privately and publicly? The first ripples of action began quietly. It wasn't an official statement. There were no press releases, no royal photographs staged for public reassurance. Instead, it started with subtle communications, private calls, discreet messages, and careful conversations between advisors and intermediaries. The goal was clear: gauge reaction, test willingness, and determine the emotional landscape before anything became public. Harry reportedly hesitated. He had built a life with Meghan on autonomy and independence. Returning to the familial fold, even partially, under the shadow of conditional inheritance, was a step fraught with emotional risk. Every phone call, every meeting, every subtle gesture became a test of patience, strategy, and emotional readiness. And Meghan, ever vigilant, watched closely. She understood the stakes better than anyone. The inheritance was significant, yes, but the condition attached to it was even more consequential. It required engagement with past hurts, negotiation of pride, and a willingness to confront the very figures he had distanced himself from. Sources indicate that early discussions were slow, measured, and tense. Advisors conveyed messages from Charles, reminding Harry that the clause existed, but emphasizing that no coercion would be applied. The king's stance was clear: he would not manipulate. He would not threaten. He would allow the couple to act of their own volition. And that's where the tension became psychological. When freedom is offered alongside obligation, the mind wrestles with multiple impulses. Pride resists manipulation. Curiosity probes the unknown. Emotion evaluates the cost. And in Harry's case, these internal debates were magnified by Meghan's counsel, public scrutiny, and the shadow of a queen whose foresight had orchestrated this intricate test. Imagine being Harry. You're thousands of miles from home. You've built a life you cherish. And suddenly, the knowledge of conditional inheritance is presented. It's not a threat, but it carries weight. A promise, contingent on action. A reward, held hostage by relationships you've struggled to maintain. According to palace insiders, Harry's initial instinct was to resist, not out of stubbornness, but out of principle. He did not want to appear as though he could be influenced by money or legacy. He did not want to return to family dynamics that had caused years of tension. He wanted independence, both emotionally and symbolically. And yet, reflection began to creep in, because the inheritance was not merely financial. It was symbolic. It represented acknowledgement, connection, and legacy. To access it was to honor family bonds in a way Harry had previously avoided. And therein lay the dilemma. How to reconcile autonomy with expectation, pride with opportunity, and independence with legacy? Meghan's influence played a crucial role. She reportedly advised caution, encouraging Harry to engage thoughtfully rather than impulsively. Her perspective emphasized long-term strategy, balancing emotional integrity with potential reconciliation. She recognized the delicate interplay between principle, perception, and practical reality. Meanwhile, Charles reportedly monitored these early interactions closely. His role was passive but pivotal. By refusing to coerce, he allowed the clause's influence to operate organically. He understood that pressure, subtle and indirect, often produced more genuine reflection than overt demands. And he was keenly aware that any misstep, either by acting too forcefully or remaining too passive, could exacerbate existing tensions. And then came the first tentative gesture. Sources suggest it began with a small, private outreach, a call, a message, a willingness to engage in dialogue. Nothing public, nothing formal. But it was significant. It represented the first acknowledgement of the clause's influence and the beginning of what could be a complex path toward reconciliation. The response from the king was reportedly measured. He did not demand action. He did not judge. He simply observed, understanding that the process of reconciliation is rarely linear. It requires patience, empathy, and the acceptance that progress often comes in fits and starts. And this is where the drama intensifies. Because the clause is no longer a theoretical construct. It has moved from legal language to human action. Every response, hesitation, or advance